We've looked at some basic harmonic analysis, but when analyzing music, it's important to also understand the role of notes in the melody in relation to what's happening harmonically underneath them. Certain notes in the melody may be chord tones, but others may be often non-harmonic tones or non-chord tones, and these fall into several possible categories of definition. To begin with, though, melodies move in either steps, which means basically an interval of a second, or skips, which refer to when a melody moves by a third or more, and these are sometimes called leaps. Let me show you a little example of this in Jingle Bells and Michael Row Your Boat from last time. So here's Michael Row Your Boat ashore, and we have skips right at the beginning because we're not having stepwise movement. We're jumping up by intervals of a third, a third, a third. And here we have even bigger jumps. We're going down by a fifth, and here we're going up by a fourth. So those are skips in the melody. But these notes can all be either chord tones or non-chord tones. The first kind of non-harmonic tone or non-chord tone is called a passing tone. And they basically provide a stepwise transition from one principal tone, another word for a chord tone, to another. So this is approached by a step and then continues by a step in the same direction. So they basically fill a melodic skip by steps. So in other words, if I put a D in there, that would be a passing tone because it's moving from one chord tone to another. It's being approached by a step and it's resolving by a step. So if there was a D there, if there was an F there, those would be passing tones between these chord tones. Now, passing tones can be either diatonic or chromatic. They can be ascending or descending, and they can be accented or unaccented, meaning they fall either right on a strong beat or between strong beats. So if they were in the middle here, they would be unaccented. But let me show you an example of some passing tones. Here's a familiar little tune called When the Saints Go Marching In, and I'll play it for you, and then I'll show you where the passing tones are. So we can see here that we're in the key of G. This C is a passing tone because it's a stepwise transition between the B and the D. So we have a passing tone there, a passing tone there, and another passing tone there. So that's a good classic example of how passing tones work. Now, similar to a passing tone is a neighboring tone. These are approached by a step and then returned by step to the same note. You see, these are passing tones because they're moving between two different notes. But if that resolved back down to a B after, that would be considered a neighboring tone. They can be either diatonic or chromatic and ascending or descending also, and they can also be either accented or unaccented. And they serve to sort of decorate a principal tone. And let me show you an example of that based on our examples from the last video. And here we go with some neighboring tones. So in Michael Row Your Boat, we have a neighboring tone here. We're in the key of C, so that A is a neighboring tone because we're coming to it from the G and then resolving to the G. So it basically decorates that G. It's an ornament. And we have an accented neighboring tone here, which is that F. We're on a E minor chord, so we're going from E to E with that F in the middle. So that's a neighboring tone between those two E's. We have a passing tone here, which I forgot to point out before, in Jingle Bells, but that's another example. But here's another neighboring tone. Again, going from the A up to the B, back down to the A. So we're in the key of G here. So we're on the 5 chord, which is D, and that A and A are chord tones on D, and the B is the neighboring tone. Let's go back here and look at some more examples. Now, you can also have what's called an incomplete neighbor. This is when there's a leap involved, which is another word for a skip, after or before a non-chord tone is reached by stepwise movement. I don't have an example of that to show you, but basically, when there's a leap either after or before a non-chord tone is reached by stepwise movement, that's considered an incomplete neighbor. Now, these types of notes that decorate the melodies are also referred to as ornaments or embellishments. Another type of ornament that we can use is called an appoggiatura. Now, this is basically an ornamental note of long or short duration that temporarily displaces and then subsequently resolves into a main note, usually by stepwise motion. Now, these little flourishes are often written as notes of a smaller size. Here's another definition. An appoggiatura is a note not normally part of a chord, which displaces a normal note of a chord. The appoggiatura resolves onto the displaced note while the chord is still sounding. An appoggiatura usually, but not always, creates a dissonance with the normal notes of the chord. So let me show you an example. Basically, an appoggiatura is a non-chord tone that's sounding at the same time as a chord and then resolves to a chord tone. Let's look at another example here. And here we have the melody with an appoggiatura added in over here. Let me play it for you. So you see, instead of going to that B natural right away, I went to the C and then resolved it to the B. So that's considered an appoggiatura, kind of a delayed resolution. Now, another type of non-chord tone is what's referred to as a suspension. And basically, this is a note from a previous chord whose resolution is delayed. It's similar to an appoggiatura. Not all appoggiaturas are suspensions, though. So the harmony shifts from one chord to another, but one or more notes from the first chord are temporarily held over before resolving stepwise to a chord tone from the new chord. Let me show you an example of that. Let's go here and look at the notation for this, and I'm going to play you this. So this is a little melody I made up, but here's a suspension because that D is being held across here. Even though the chord is changing on this beat, we don't get to that next chord tone until this beat. And similarly here, we're going up the G triad, but that G is held over here when we're changing to a D chord, but a D chord doesn't get resolved to until we hit that F sharp there. So let me play it for you one more time. So a delayed resolution. Now the opposite of a suspension is called an anticipation, and this basically is when a chord tone for the upcoming chord is played early. Let me show you an example of that. So here we see we're having a G triad, but this anticipation is the A natural, which isn't a chord tone in G, it's a chord tone in D, and it is being sounded early before it actually arrives on the D chord there. And similarly here, this G is not really a chord tone for D, it's a chord tone for this G triad here, but it's being played early or in anticipation. And same thing here, this F sharp is an anticipation of the D triad coming up. So let me play it for you one more time. Same thing here, I forgot to write it in, but that G is also an anticipation of that G triad. So that's an example of some basic harmonic analysis. It does get more complex, but these are the basic ideas to work with: passing tones, neighboring tones, either incomplete neighbors or complete neighbors. And it's important to understand also that they can be diatonic or chromatic, and we've looked at only diatonic examples here, but chromatic neighbors can really give some interesting shape and color and nuance to a melody. And then using appoggiaturas and suspensions and anticipations, they're all nice little devices for adding some drama and color and shape to your melodies. So that's it for now. See you in the next video for more.